Good morning, Year 11, and welcome today to your Conflict and Tension screencast for Lesson 6, How did the League of Nations begin? So first of all, with the League of Nations, we need to know that the League of Nations was Woodrow Wilson's idea. And Woodrow Wilson then was the leader of the USA, so the president of the USA in 1919. And that's really, really important because he comes up with the idea around the time they're discussing the Treaty of Versailles. And we can see kind of this here. We've got Woodrow Wilson in the image, and this was a source from an exam not long ago, and we can see him blowing his idea into the sky of the League of Nations. And we can see he's holding onto a pot called idealism. So idealism is where the idea is good, but in reality, it tends to fail. So in practice, when something is actually done, it tends to fail. And the League of Nations then was one of Wilson's 14 points. He came up with the 14 points at the Treaty of Versailles and said, this is how we achieve world peace, and the League of Nations was crucial to that. So what was the main aim of the League of Nations then? Well, the main aim of the League of Nations was that it would be a group of nations that from across the world that would stop war. That was the main kind of aim of it. It would be absolutely all about stopping war. But not all nations were allowed in the League of Nations or joined the League of Nations. The United States failed to join the League of Nations because they had a laissez-faire, an isolationist policy, so a leave us alone policy. We're going to focus on Americans. We don't need to get involved in Europe. So straight away we can kind of see the image here of Uncle Sam, who represents America, and we can see that all the countries are trying to pull America into the League of Nations, but the League of Nations is standing firm. Now, if we think about the negatives of this for the League of Nations, then straight away the League start off on a negative point because the president whose idea it was America. It was America's idea, and yet America don't join because the Senate, the American Parliament, refused to join. So why should other nations join the League of Nations and believe in it if its own creator doesn't? And that was the very common idea. The USSR were not allowed to join the League of Nations because the League of Nations were mostly capitalist countries in the USSR, so Russia had just become communist. So the USSR then were seen as a threat. So the USSR were not allowed to join the League of Nations, and we can see this from a Russian poster here. We can see the three capitalist countries of America, Britain, and France. Now, this is really important because this was obviously before America refused to join the League of Nations, but just symbolised that it was seen as an elitist organisation, one for just the powerful countries and not all countries, maybe showing that the League weren't serious about their own aims. And finally, Germany were not allowed to join the League of Nations because of the carnage of the First World War. And this is really shown here in this image. We can see a man kind of here welcoming some new members, and we've got the members of the League of Nations here are trying to introduce the League to new members. And we can see that this man says, "I bring you our brothers from Germany and Russia." And the League of Nations members, who are, I'm going to just re-highlight them in blue, say, "No thank you. See what they bring. They are flame projectors, not extinguishers." So Germany and Russia, they're going to, blow things up out of proportion. They're going to be starting the fires, not putting the fires of war out. So we don't want them. Again, showing the League of Nations to be exclusionary. How can you stop wars if you start excluding countries from conversations? So the Treaty of Versailles then basically agreed that the League of Nations would come into existence, and the Treaty of Versailles also agreed on the League of Nations Covenant. And the League of Nations Covenant had 4 parts to it. It can be remembered as the 4 M's. So we have we have mitigation, which is talking, and that's the first M. The second M is moral condemnation, so a telling off. The third M is money, so economic sanctions. And the fourth M is using the League of Nations military. And all those were supposedly a set of rules to be able to stop war. However, there were big problems with the covenant, so the rules to stop the League of Nations. Mitigation, so just talking, could be absolutely ignored by the aggressive warring country. The aggressive country could also have ignored mitigation, so the warning. And the one that could have worked, which was, stopping economic trade with those aggressive nations, didn't work, because the aggressive nations would just trade with the US, because the US weren't part of the League of Nations. And this is really important, because if the League had been part of the League of Nations, what you could go on to say is that those nations who were warring, they wouldn't have any big superpowers to trade with, which means their economy would suffer. They would potentially face economic collapse, rebellion from their own people, but also they wouldn't be able to fund, tanks, planes, factories to build war machines if their economy is unstable. However, as we know, the USA did not join the League of Nations, which meant that warring countries, aggressive countries, even though the League said in some cases we will not trade with you, they would just trade with America, and they were still able to have a good economy. So the economic sanctions had no real impact on aggressive countries. And we can see this in the cartoon here, which was a cartoon from last year's GCSE exam, and it's a very common one, but we can see the bridge of the League of Nations here, and there is a gap. So if something is trying to cross that gap, it would fall through. It shows that the bridge is unstable, and the bridge represents the League of Nations, as we can see here. So the League of Nations is unstable, and we can see the only thing that's going to make it stable is Uncle Sam and the America Keystone, which he is guarding, and he's quite relaxed because he's like, we're not joining, we've got this kind of isolationist policy, we're not interested in joining. And it really can you link back to those economic sanctions. If that keystone is in, the League of Nations works, and countries can't go to war because of economic sanctions. However, as we know, the USA don't do that, and the economic sanctions aren't effective because countries just trade with the USA. And finally, we have this idea of the League of Nations military, which is completely useless because the League of Nations do not have a military. So it's an empty threat. And I think one of the sources to kind of sum this up that we'll have looked at quite a little bit is this idea of the dog of war being shackled. Now, there's two sorts of interpretations of this, and we've seen it come up both in it's showing the League of Nations in a positive light, but also the League of Nations in a negative light. So I'm going to go through both. I'm going to show the negative side in red and the positive side in green. So if we look at it from a positive side first, then we can see that this dog is called the dog of war. And we can see that the League of Nations has shackled it. So if a dog is shackled, it is unable to bite. So it shows the League in a successful light, doesn't it? And then you can kind of bring in the League's successes if you were talking about that. However, there's another interpretation here that we can get from this source, and it can be the negative one. Because even though the League of Nations has shackled it, we can see that the dog is still quite aggressive. So yes, the League of Nations has stopped war temporarily, but it hasn't changed the behaviour of countries. Countries are still going to be aggressive. This dog is still going to be aggressive. And the time that this mask slips, and it only needs to slip once, aggression will come out. And we can kind of see that If we look at sort of the weakness of the covenant, that could be brought in from the weakness of moral condemnation, mitigation, economic sanctions, no military. So it can definitely be seen as negative as well. The fact that this is, the League of Nations being created is temporary. It has to have a long-term impact to stop aggressive countries, not just a shackle all the time, which is impossible to do. So definitely there's a positive side to this source and there's a negative side to it.